Hello there everyone, and welcome to a new video on the Future Programmer YouTube channel about the Streamlit package in Python. In this tutorial, you'll learn about various input widgets in Streamlit, including buttons, sliders, text inputs, and more. So without further ado, let's go ahead and begin. On my screen right here, you can see two windows open. On the left, we have the code that I'm going to be writing, and on the right side, I have the Streamlit app opened in a web browser. The two are currently synced, so whatever changes I made to the left will be shown in the application on the right. To begin, of course, we would first need to import Streamlit as st so we can use the various features of Streamlit. The first input widget that we're going to talk about is the simple button. So the st.button function is going to return to us a boolean of either true or false. So let's pass in a label of, let's just say, button, or let's just say click me, actually. And then let's store the returned value in a variable called isClicked. So if the function returns true and isClicked is true, then we can say if isClicked, we will use st.write to print out the value of isClicked and the text button is clicked, like so. So I'm going to actually change the right side to make it always rerun as soon as I save the file on the left. So you can see if I click on the button that says click me, we'll see true, which is the value of isClicked, because this time st.button is going to return the value of true. And the second line, button is clicked, is also printed out because of this line right here. Do note though, if I keep clicking on this button, it actually won't change anything because as soon as a button is clicked, it's going to remain true. Of course, I can reload this entire tab and the button will reset to false. But if you would like to have the ability to toggle between true and false, you would probably need something like a checkbox, which we'll talk about in just a second. While on the topic of buttons, actually there are two more features that we're going to talk about in regard to st.button. So let's write a new button. So let's see, primary button. And the difference between this button right here and this one right here is we're going to set the type of the button to be primary. And if I save this file, you'll see on the right side, we have a primary button that looks orange instead of the white that we see up here. This is a primary button, and by default, a button is going to be secondary. And of course, we can specify that as well if you would like. So let's change this to secondary. And this will need to be lowercase. So we see this button right here. And if you need to in your program, you can also disable a button. So I'm going to change this to be disabled. And instead of type, I'm going to write disabled equals to true. So this way, you can see this button is not clickable. I can't click on it because it is currently disabled. The second input widget for today is the link button. It is similar to a button, except that it does not return true or false. It actually just, whenever I click on the button, it's going to lead us to a link. So if I write st.link button and I pass in the label, let's just say go to, let's say Google, and the URL is going to be https and then :/w3.google.com, like so. So now if I click on this button, it's going to bring us to the homepage of Google. I'm actually going to wrap the code file right here so we can see the lines without having to scroll horizontally. And like before, we can also change the type of the button to primary. So if I duplicate this line and change this to, let's say, streamlit.io, and I will change this link right here to streamlit.io, and I can add a type argument to be primary. And this way we can see this button is more pronounced than the button right here. And if I click on it, we'll be brought to the homepage of streamlit.io. And lastly, we can also disable a button by using the disabled parameter like before. So let's say example.com, and we'll change this to be w3.example.com. And instead of type, actually we can keep the type. Type is primary, but in addition, we'll have disabled to be true. and we can see it's disabled. So no matter if it's primary or secondary, it will remain disabled. Next up, let's talk about checkboxes. So checkboxes are similar to buttons, except that we can actually toggle between true and false. So here's what I mean. If I have st.checkbox, and if I have a label called checkbox, and value, we will talk about this in a second, but for now, we'll just have st.checkbox called checkbox. On the right side, you can see a box and the label checkbox. If I click on this, currently nothing happens, but if we store this variable or store this return value in a variable called isChecked, and we can use this boolean to now do different things. So if isChecked is true, we'll use st.write to show the variable is checked and the checkbox is checked. Otherwise, we can also print out the checkbox is not checked. So on the right side, we can see if I were to click on this button, so now it is true, we see the value of is checked becoming true, and we see the checkbox is checked. I can actually also uncheck this box to make the output become the checkbox is not checked. As you saw briefly a few moments ago, there's also another parameter within st.checkbox, which is the parameter value. So if I have a st.checkbox, let's call this checkbox2, I can actually set value to be true. So by default, the value is going to be false. So when I first entered this page, you noticed that checkbox was not checked. But I can actually make it by default to be true. So by default, checked. So value, if it's equal to true, we'll see when the page loads, checkbox 2 is checked. The toggle widget is very similar to the checkbox, except it looks slightly different. So let's make a variable called isOn, which is equal to st.toggle, and let's put the name as toggle. And of course, we also have the option of setting value to be true or false. But for now, we'll just leave this off. And if is on, we will use st.write to print out toggle is on. Otherwise, we'll print out toggle is off. So this way, we can see we can turn this on or off, on, we can see toggle is on, off, toggle is now off. So it's very similar to the checkboxes that we saw earlier. And of course, we can change the value to be true. And this way, whenever the page loads, it will be on by default. The next widget that we will discuss is the radio widget. Let's write st.radio, and we see a couple of parameters, label, options, and index. So what this is doing is Streamlit is going to take the label as, of course, the label, and then options is kind of like a multiple choice question. The user is able to choose from a selection of options, and they can select one, and that will be the return value of the radio function. So label, let's say favorite programming language. Options, let's give the options of Python, JavaScript, and C++. Index, let's give it, well, 0 is just going to be a default value will be set to Python. If we are to choose index as 1, then the default value will be JavaScript. But let's leave it as 0, of course, since Python is our favorite programming language. I'm going to store this value in a variable called favorite language. And I will print out favorite language like this. So here on the right side, you can see favorite programming language, Python, JavaScript, or C++. If I change index to be 1, when the page loads, the default value will be JavaScript. If we keep it 0, it will be Python. And we can select the various options, and you can see the output changing accordingly below. Something else you can do with the radio buttons is you can add a caption to each of the options. So these are the actual options that we're choosing from, Python, JavaScript, C++, but of course you can have more. And the other thing we can do is add the captions argument, which is going to be a list with the same length as the options. So we can add a caption to each of these different options. So in this case, I'm going to add py as the file extension generally used for Python, JS for JavaScript, and C++ or CPP for C++. And you can see these captions are displayed right below each of these options. But of course, the return value is only going to contain the actual option and not the caption. Something else you can do with st.radio is you can display the options horizontally. So if we have, let's say, st.radio, let's keep this something generic like label, and then options, let's give this a value of A, B, and C. And we're going to give it an extra, let's just see how this looks right now. So we see A, B, C vertically. But if I were to change the horizontal argument to be true, we'll see A, B, and C are now displayed horizontally. And this can save space when you have short options like A, B, and C. Of course, if you have longer options like Python, JavaScript, and C++, you might consider using the vertical option instead. But displaying the options horizontally is certainly an option if you would so choose. The next input widget that we're going to talk about is the Selectbox, which is somewhat similar to radio. Now think about radio buttons. Right now we have 3 options for each of these radio widgets. But what if we have more than 3? What if we have hundreds of different options that we're choosing from? Let's say choosing from a list of names, and we could have hundreds or even thousands or tens of thousands of names. Then we certainly don't want to show all of the options directly on the page. We would probably want to show a drop-down menu that the user can click on and select the options from. And that is where Selectbox comes in. So we have st.selectbox, and we can pass in the label of operating system you are using. The options, let's just give it Windows, Mac OS, and Linux. And index, of course, is just going to correspond to the index of the default option, which right now it will be Windows, so let's just leave it as Windows. And let's use st.write to print out the variable OS, which I have yet to define. So OS is equal to the return value of st.selectbox. If I save this, we can see the option of Windows shown up here and the output of Windows shown down here. I can click on anywhere on this box and select a different option. And right now it is quite simple. I can click on this and select 1 out of 3 options. But what if you have thousands of different options within this drop-down menu? It would be a lot harder to scroll through all of these options. So instead what you could do is type in this box. Let's say I want to select Linux. I can type in LNI and you can see Linux has shown up. So I can click on this and Linux has been selected. One thing you might notice about the current way this widget is behaving is that it has a default option even after I reload the page. So if I scroll down, we see Windows. But what if we don't want to have a default option shown to the user before they make their choice? Well, what you could do is use a placeholder instead. So I can write another Selectbox widget. Let's do Selectbox like so. Label is going to be favorite subject, as in favorite subject in school. I can have the options of math, history, and science. And index, instead of a number, I'm going to choose none instead. And with that, I can choose a placeholder argument of something like please select your favorite subject. And I'm going to use st.write to print out subject, which I have yet to define once again, and I will do so right now. So subject is equal to st.selectbox, and we can see if I rerun this web page, favorite subject, please select your favorite subject. So right now subject is returning none, and that is shown right here. And we can still see the options right here, math, history, science. And one of the things you can do now is you can actually click this X button to clear the value that you've selected. So if you want to make a select box optional in a way, you can do so with the current format that you see right here. Up here, you cannot have a blank choice. You have to have a choice. So that's the difference between the 2 different ways of using Selectbox. Something else you might notice about Selectbox is that we can only select one of these options. What if we like math and history, and these are our favorite subjects, as in 2 of them, instead of just selecting one of them? What if we love them equally? Well, we can use the Multiselect widget. Using this widget, you can use st.multiselect. Label, let's ask for the direction that the user is moving in for whatever reason. So direction you are going in at the moment. And then options, let's give the options of not a dictionary, but a list of east, west, south, and north. And default is going to be east and let's say north. So the reason why we're using multi-select in this case is we can move in two directions essentially at the same time, east and north, for example. So on the right side, you can see direction you're going in and you can choose multiple options. You can also add west or south, but of course this does not make any sense because you can't move, east and west and south and north at the same time. So we can add the argument of max selections equals to 2. And this way, if I were to click on this, you will see you can only select up to 2 options, remove an option first. So I have to remove north to add south. But of course, there's also the problem with that you can select east and west at the same time, and nothing will actually warn you about you not being able to do so. You will have to handle that logic in your actual program itself. So let's change this to east and south or something like that. And we can print out using st.write, of course, the direction, which is the variable that I'm going to store the return value of this function in. And you can see that this is actually going to be a list. And you can verify this by printing out the type of direction. And you'll see built-in.list. That is the class of direction. And you'll see direction has 2 elements, the first of which is east, the second of which is south. And that matches the inputs that we have given the multi-select box above. Next, let's talk about sliders. The st.slider function is going to allow us to input numbers. So st.slider, and we can pass in a label. Let's just say age. Min value, 0 is fine. Maximum age, let's put 150 years old. Value, let's put a default of 18. And step is going to be 1. And then st.write will print out the value returned, which we'll store in a variable called age. So st.write age. On the right side, you can see a slider that we can drag from all the way from 0, which you can see reflected here, to a maximum of 150. You can select other values in between as well. Right now we have a step argument of 1, which means between every 2 numbers, so we have 51, and the next value will be 52, 53, 54. So every interval between every 2 numbers is going to be 1. So what if you want to have something bigger? You can just change it to 2. And you'll see it goes from 18 to 20 to 22, etc. If you want to change this to less than 1 though, you'll have to change more than one thing. So if I change this to 0.5, you actually see an error thrown on the right. And that is because it's saying we have to have arguments match their types. So step has a type of a floating point number. However, min value, max value, and value all have integer values. So what you can do is instead add a 0.0 to the end, and our program will now work again. So 18.00, 18.50, 19.0, 19.5, 20.0, etc. But generally, we probably just need step equals to 1. In addition to selecting a single value, we can also use st.slider to select a range of values. So if I have st.slider and I want to ask the user for the range, or let's just say number of people to, let's say, a party or something, and then min value will be 0, max value will be, let's keep it 100. Value, if I pass in 2 values for this argument, so let's say 0 to 100, that means we're selecting, instead of a single value, we're using the slider to select a range of values. Step we can keep as 1, and we'll store this in 2 variables instead of 1. So minimum and maximum will be equal to the return value of this function, and we'll print out minimum and maximum. Here you can see, instead of having just one circle, one dot on the slider as you see above, we actually see two of these dots, which we can both drag independently of each other to a certain range, although you can't have them go past each other in the other way. So the minimum value will be 22 and the maximum value will be 74. So st.slider in this case is going to return two numbers, the minimum number and the maximum number in the range that the user selects. Now the default slider that we have been using just now can only be used to select numbers, but we can't use it to select things that are non-numerical. For that, we'll need the select slider, which we can use to select non-numerical data. So what if we want to select the grade, so A, B, C, D, or failing, or something like that? So we can have a variable, grade is equal to st.select slider, label is equal to grade, options will be to A, B, C, D, and F, or something like that. Value, we don't really need that. And we'll use st.write to print out grade. Here you can see a slider, just like before, except that the options are now non-numerical. It is the A, B, C, D, and F that we see printed out down beneath the actual slider. The next input widget is quite simple. We have text input. Let's just enter the name of the user. So name is equal to st.textInput. And we have a couple of arguments. The first of which is the label. Let's just put in name. The default value we can save as an empty string. Max characters we can set at 100. And right now I am capable of entering, let's say, future programmer in this box. But nothing happens because we have not yet printed out anything. So st.write. Let's use an f string here for fun. Hello, name, exclamation mark. And you'll see hello future programmer printed out. But right now a problem is that if I delete this input and press enter, we just have a odd looking string right here. So what we can do to handle that is write if name. So if name has been inputted, it is not an empty string, then we will print this out. So right now we have nothing, but if I were to enter future programmer and hit enter, we'll see the output returning right here. In addition to using sliders, there's also another way of entering numbers, which is the number input. So let's say st.numberInput, and for label, let's ask the user for the number of continents they have or you have visited, minimum value of 0, maximum value of 7, value will be 1, and step will be 1. And let's print out the return value, which we will save in the variable num continents, as you see here, and we'll print this out. So here you can see a box which we can type into. We can either type another value into. If I type 12, we can see value must be less than or equal to 7. That is the maximum value. So I can keep 1, press enter, and we'll see 1 right here. Or I can change it to, let's say, 4 and hit enter, and it will become 4. But the other thing you can do with this box is use these buttons right here. You can use the minus button to subtract all the way until the minimum value, or use the plus button to click it until we get to the maximum value of 7. Next, let's talk about text area. So the other way of inputting text is through a larger text box. So essay, let's call this variable essay, is equal to st.textArea, as you see here. Label, let's just call this essay. Value will be, well, let's give it a default value of a very, very, very long essay. Height, we don't really need that right now. Max characters, we don't need that. And we will print out essay. So instead of having just one line, as we see here, I cannot enter a new line here, but we can with a text area. I can press enter, and let's say enter again, and I can type in a new line. Now to apply all of these changes, I would need to hit, as you can see here, Control and enter. So if I press Control Enter at the same time, you can see the essay variable is now storing these two lines. The next two input widgets that we're dealing with all have to do with date and time. So the first one is date input. If we want to select a day of the year, then we can use this. So let's name a variable date, or let's actually be more specific. Let's say birthday is equal to st.date input. The label will be your birthday, and value will be the string today. So if we are to set the string today as the default value, that would mean the day that the user is currently on is going to be used as the default value. And we don't really need a minimum or maximum value here. So you can see today is December 28th of 2023. I can click on this and we get this fancy and cool date input that I can scroll through to select some day. So for example, September 13th or something like that. And of course, we can type in this actual box. If I want to change this to 2021, I can do so very conveniently. And you can also actually see the changes being applied in the date input right after I change this in the box. And let's just also print out the birthday variable that you can see right here. Time input is very similar, though a little bit more complicated. So if I have a variable called time, and it is the return value of st.timeinput, we can have a label of bedtime, value of, let's say, now, which is the equivalent of today, except for time inputs. So this is the time at the current moment, and let's print out st.write time. And you can see bedtime is obviously not going to be 4:28, so instead we can scroll down to 10 o'clock or something like that. And the other option you can add in here is the step argument. So step, the minimum value I believe is 60 seconds. This is in seconds. So now instead of every 15 minutes, the options are going to be every 1 minute. So this is 4:27, and this is going to be 4:28, 4:29, etc. I can change this to 3600, which would be an hour. So 3600 seconds is equal to 1 hour. So I can change between 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock and so on. So generally 60 seconds or 3600 seconds is probably the way to go. So 4:29 p.m. Streamlit also allows us to upload files to our web applications. And this is especially useful if you want to allow your user to upload a file from their computer into your program so you can analyze it or visualize it or train that data into a machine learning model or something like that. So I can store the result from file uploader into a variable called file. The label will be equal to, upload file, and the other ones we can just use the default values for these options. And I'm going to write st.write file.read.decode UTF-8. And I'll explain this in a second, but right now, if I were to save this file is not currently saved at the moment. If I were to save this file, we can see an attribute error showing up on the right. None type has no attribute read, and that is because this is going to return either none, so file is either going to be none if we don't have a file currently uploaded, or it's going to give us the actual file which we want to read. So if we don't have a file uploaded, it is going to, of course, throw this attribute error because we don't actually have a file to be read at the moment. So instead, we can add a new line here if file is not none. So we have already uploaded a file, then we want to read it and decode it into UTF-8, which if we don't have, I'll show you what happens in just a second. So I'm going to click on the Browse Files button, and on my desktop, we have one file, text.txt, which I have entered this text into a few moments ago. So hello, you're reading text from a text document, text.txt. That is the text contained in this document that I have just uploaded from my computer. If I were to get rid of the decode method call right here, we'll see a bytecode instead of a string, which is still fairly readable, but probably not what we need for whatever purposes we are using this file content later on for. Lastly, let's talk about color picker. Streamlit allows the user to pick a color from, well, all the colors. So let's use the st.colorPicker function, favorite color as the label, value, let's give this a default value of, let's say, black. So hashtag 000000. So this is going to be the hex code for the color black. And let's use st.write color to print out whatever value we have selected. And of course, I would need to first assign the return value into a variable called color. So here, if I were to click on this color picker right here, we get this whole thing, which we can select. If I want to choose a slightly blue color, like this one right here, I can click out of this and we'll see the color code for this color printed out right here. And after over 120 lines, we have completed our lesson on the most important input widgets that Streamlit supports. You've learned about various ways you can allow your user to input information into your programs that you can use later on, including buttons, checkboxes, toggle buttons, radio selections, multi-select, sliders, file uploading, color pickers, and more. If you found this video to be helpful, please consider subscribing to this YouTube channel down below and sharing this video with your friends. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments section and I'll be more than happy to help. With that said, thank you very much for watching this video and I hope to see you in more tutorials in the future. In the meanwhile, happy streamliting!